Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing some pretty exciting news coming out of the San Jose Sharks today, and that is that they have recalled defenseman Henry Thrun from the San Jose Barracuda. Now, the story of Henry Thrun is pretty interesting. Acquired last year around the trade deadline from the Anaheim Ducks in exchange for a third-round pick. Thrun was destined to be an unrestricted free agent at the end of the year and did not want to sign with the Anaheim Ducks, and so the Sharks paid a premium third-round pick to get the opportunity to discuss with Henry Thrun and try and convince him to come to San Jose. That would end up working out. The Sharks would get a contract done pretty quickly, and he would play the last few games of the regular season with the Sharks. And it would go rather well. He'd end up finding himself on a pairing with Erik Karlsson, and he'd perform quite solidly for an NHL rookie defenseman. And so it seemed as though, especially with the departure of Erik Karlsson, that Thrun would be not necessarily a lock going into the next season, but he'd have a very good chance of making the roster. However, after a rookie tournament and then a relatively underwhelming preseason, he ended up getting to starting the season in the minor leagues. And usually, I would be against sending a younger player to the minor leagues in favor of a washed-up veteran or something like that. But in this case, Thrun really wasn't all that impressive through preseason, and so it made sense to me to get him some reps in the minors. Now, admittedly, I haven't really watched the Barracuda this season, but in terms of looking at his statistics, they don't exactly jump off the page. 18 games played and just 6 points, and while Thrun is not expected to be an offensive juggernaut, he's not an Erik Karlsson or a Brent Burns, he was expected to bring somewhat more of a two-way game, and especially with the Barracuda actually scoring a decent amount of goals this season, not an outstanding amount, but a decent amount, the fact that he only sits at 6 points is not all that great. On top of that, he is also a -9, and so while I do not know all the details of how he has played, the stats don't exactly support him having a fantastic season thus far, and yet he does get the call-up anyway. And so you may be wondering, well, why is that the case? Especially since as of late, the Sharks have been playing some pretty solid hockey. Well, if we take a look at these last 4 games, the Sharks have indeed scored 22 goals, which is extremely good. But on the other hand, through those same 4 games, they've also given up 18 goals. And so if not for this offensive explosion that they have had over this past week, we would be talking a much different tune where it would be, well, why are the Sharks giving up 4.5 goals on average per game? And the fact is that there are a lot of defensemen in the lineup thus far currently for the Sharks who just aren't really NHL defensemen. Vlasic is, of course, the prime candidate for that. He'd probably have even worse stats than Thrun with the Barracuda. Kyle Burroughs has never really been all that good this season, so he was someone who was already seemingly going to be the 7th defenseman, if not due to injuries. Ahutyuk, while liked by David Quinn, has not had that many great outings, and even Kalen Addison has struggled as of late. And so realistically, there isn't necessarily a top 6 here for the Sharks that you really want to keep together, especially with how defensively these last few games have gone. And so getting Henry Thrun in here and giving him an opportunity and giving him some reps does make some sense, especially from the standpoint where, of course, Mike Grier and the Sharks as a whole are not necessarily looking to squeeze out every possible point in the standings this year, because in 23-24 it is very, very, very unlikely the Sharks are going to be competing for anything. Never mind an actual Stanley Cup, just a playoff spot is pretty much out of reach at this point. However, in 3 years' time from now, the Sharks will be trying to edge out every possible points most likely. And so getting Thrun the experience currently in 23-24 will bode well in 26-27 or whatever future year the Sharks are looking to be competitive in. And so even if the winning percentage drops by a couple of percentage points by removing, let's say, Marc-Edouard Vlasic from the lineup in favor of Thrun, and honestly there's an argument to be made that the winning percentage actually rises with such a move, it is still definitely worth it to get some of the younger players on the Barracuda some options. It is also very interesting that last season we saw the Sharks kind of dig into the Barracuda prospect pool and see who they can get some NHL games for back at the end of the season around March. This year they seem to be starting that, so though maybe this is just a one-time thing, they seem to be starting that here in early December. And so does that mean that the Sharks are going to be constantly rotating players up from their minor league throughout the rest of this season? Perhaps, perhaps not. But the fact that it is happening this early is quite telling of what the idea here is for Mike Grier. Now, the obvious question will also here end up being, well, is Thrun going to be able to stick around? And honestly, he doesn't exactly have all that tough competition to outperform. If he does play as though he did in the preseason, he probably gets a couple of games, then gets sent back down, and maybe we see someone like a Gavanka get the next opportunity, or a Mukhamadullin. But honestly, if he plays pretty well, if he ends up putting up a solid performance, it's very possible he finds himself on a pairing with either Kalen Addison or perhaps Mario Ferraro. He could be someone who could play out much of the rest of this regular season, depending on how things fall into place as players do return from injury, like Emberson and like Matt Benning. So definitely a very exciting move here from Mike Grier. This is going to be a very cool opportunity to see if Thrun in this NHL regular season can find the game that he had last year, get back to that, and become an NHL regular, or even if this is just a couple of game stretch, it'll be interesting to check in on how he is doing thus far. Class dismissed.